"I ain't got nowhere to go, sir, but I can cook," she whispered to the widowed rancher on Christmas Eve. Dust Creek, Wyoming Territory, Christmas Eve, 1887. A thin layer of snow blanketed the narrow road into Dust Creek. The town lay still beneath a pale gray sky, its wooden buildings silent, windows dark. Wind swept through the empty street, whistling between the boards of shuttered porches, slicing like a blade of ice. On that road, a woman walked alone, her head bowed beneath a threadbare shawl, her coat thin against the merciless cold. Elmina Hartley was 28 years old, and she had lost everything. 2 months ago, her husband had died, suddenly, without warning. Days later came the knock at the door. Creditors. Papers with signatures she had never seen. Debts he had kept hidden. They took the house, the land, even her mother's wedding quilt. All that remained were a fraying sack and 3 things too worthless to steal: a dented cast-iron pot, a worn wooden spoon, and a dull paring knife. Now she wandered into Dust Creek, a stranger with nowhere to go on the loneliest night of the year, Christmas Eve. She knocked on the first door, a flicker of movement behind a curtain, then silence. At the second, a woman cracked the door, took one look at her, and snapped, "We don't feed beggars." The third door opened briefly before a man grunted, "No charity here. Try the mission, if it's open." Snow stung her cheeks. Her breath came in shaky clouds. Her arms tightened around the sack, though it held nothing of real worth. She reached the edge of the square, near an old bench and a broken wagon. Her legs gave out. She sank to the ground, shivering. Her stomach clenched. Her hands, cracked and red, scraped together kindling. Twigs. Straw. One match. She struck it. The flame wavered, then held. She built a small fire between 3 stones, balanced her dented pot above it, and added the last of her dried beans, a scoop of snow, and from her apron, a pinch of thyme. A sliver of garlic she had hidden in her boot, a few specks of pepper, her last. The soup simmered. Slowly, a scent rose. Something warm, faintly sweet. It traveled on the wind like a whisper of another world. Not rich, not grand, but real, nourishing. Someone noticed. From across the square, a figure emerged through the snow, wrapped in a worn wool blanket. He moved with a steady, unhurried gait. Long gray hair trailed from beneath a hat, his face lined deep with years and silence. A Comanche elder. He knelt by her fire. "That," he said, "is the scent of someone who remembers." Elmina flinched. "It's just soup, sir." He smiled faintly. "It's more than that." She offered him a spoonful. He accepted, sipping slowly, his eyes closed. "My wife cooked like this," he murmured, as if feeding someone's soul. The quiet between them opened gently. Elmina told him her story, her husband's death, the debts, the eviction, the closed doors. The old man listened, his expression unreadable, his stillness comforting. When she finished, he stirred the fire. "This town has no place for you," he said, "but there might be one elsewhere." Her head lifted. 12 miles northwest, he continued, there's a ranch, Red Hollow. The man who runs it, Caleb Rourke, lost his wife 5 winters back. Since then, he's turned to stone. No one stays long. But you, he tapped his chest, you cook with memory. That might reach him. You think he'd let me work? I think his heart is not dead, just waiting. Not for hands, for soul. Snow swirled softly around them. Old Crow stood slowly. From inside his blanket, he pulled a square of cornbread, still warm. He pressed it into her hands. You're shaking, he said. From cold, from fear, both pass. But if you keep cooking from the heart, a door will open, not for your hands, but for your life. Elmina looked at the bread as if it were gold. Her lips parted, but no words came. Thank you, she managed at last. He nodded. Follow the ridge. At the fork, take the left path. Go at dawn. And then he walked away, his shape vanishing into the snow. like a shadow swallowed by wind. Elmina stayed there, beside the dying fire, clutching the cornbread to her chest. Her limbs still trembled. The snow kept falling. The wind still stung. But deep inside her, beneath all the fear and weariness, something stirred. Not warmth, not yet, but the shape of it. Hope. Red Hollow Ranch, Christmas morning, 1887. The sky had begun to pale by the time Elmina reached the edge of Red Hollow Ranch. Her legs barely carried her. Each step sent fire through her blistered feet. The wind stung her face like needles, and the snowfall from the night had crusted over the ground, hard and cruel. But there, beyond a line of bare cottonwoods, she saw it. Long wooden fences, a cluster of barns, and the large log house Old Crow had described. Her breath caught. She nearly collapsed at the final gate. She shuffled up the path and raised a trembling hand to knock. The door opened with a creak before she could touch it. Two ranch hands stood there, wrapped in heavy coats, coffee steam curling around them. Their expressions shifted quickly from surprise to suspicion to mocking amusement. "Well, would you look at this?" one said, tilting his head. "Santa drop you off, miss?" The other let out a short laugh. "This ain't no poorhouse, lady. Ain't got no room for strays." Elmina didn't speak. She couldn't. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth from cold. Her dress was torn at the hem, and her fingers clutched the frayed strap of her sack. Her hair, wild from the wind, clung to her cheeks. She stood there like a shadow that had wandered too far from the night. One of the men added with a smirk, "You sure do not look like you would last long in a Wyoming gust." She took a breath, shallow and shaking. Then another, and with the last strength in her chest, she forced the words out. "I ain't got nowhere to go, sir, but I can cook." A hush settled over the porch. The two men glanced at each other, unsure how to answer, until a new presence filled the space behind them. Bootsteps, heavier, slower, sounded on the wooden floor. Then Caleb Rourke appeared. He said nothing at first. Tall, broad, built like a man who had long stopped asking the world for mercy, Caleb stood in the doorway with the quiet authority of someone who had held too much weight too long. His face bore the hard lines of silence and solitude. His eyes were dark, unreadable, shadowed not by weariness, but by absence, like something had been carved out of him long ago and never filled again. He looked at Elmina, not in pity, not in anger, just looked. Elmina stood straighter. Her knees shook beneath her, but her eyes met his. Not defiant, not pleading, just steady, as if everything in her life had led to this single, frozen moment. The silence stretched. Then, finally, Caleb spoke. "You cook?" "Yes, sir." "Experience?" "Yes." Another pause. The wind whistled across the yard behind her, lifting snow from the porch. The two ranch hands waited, barely breathing. Caleb studied her face, as though trying to solve a riddle he did not remember asking. Then he nodded once. 7 days. She blinked. "Sir? 7 days to prove you are worth feeding this crew. You cook, they eat. If they work better because of it, you stay. If not, you leave." Elmina swallowed. Her voice cracked. "Yes, sir." "It is not charity," he said flatly. "I understand." He turned to the men. "Show her the kitchen, and give her the back room. It is empty." One of them muttered a soft, "Yes, sir," and stepped aside. Elmina followed, almost stumbling as her frozen legs tried to move again. As she passed through the doorway into the dim hallway of the main house, she felt Caleb's gaze on her back. She did not turn around. He watched her until the shadows swallowed her figure. Then, so low, no one could hear it but the empty hall, he murmured to himself, "Christmas morning, and another lost soul at my door." The morning air bit through the cracks in the kitchen walls, and frost clung to the windows like a second curtain. Elmina stood alone in the heart of Red Hollow's long-neglected kitchen. Dust coated the shelves, and rust marked the edges of iron pans hanging askew. The stove's hearth had long since gone cold, and the table bore deep scars and burns from meals made and forgotten. She tightened her apron and set down her sack. With quiet purpose, she rolled up her sleeves and began to clean. By the time the sky lightened fully, the kitchen had changed. The fire crackled again. The scent of warm butter, garlic, and nutmeg drifted into the hall. Elmina worked with steady hands. Flour and cornmeal mixed into thick batter, dropped in spoonfuls onto a griddle until the edges crisped golden. She whisked eggs until they shone like morning light and sliced smoked pork thin, frying it with onions until the air shimmered with savory heat. She did not rush. She cooked like someone who believed food could matter. When the ranch hands filed in from the yard, stomping snow from their boots, the kitchen met them like a different world. They stopped at the threshold. No one spoke. One man sniffed the air and blinked like he had walked into a dream. Another scratched his beard, clearly thrown by the warmth, the smells, the strange order to the once-forgotten room. Elmina turned from the stove. "Good morning," she said gently. "Breakfast is ready." For a beat, no one moved. Then one of them, tall, weathered, with a scar down his cheek, stepped forward and picked up a plate. He scooped a serving of eggs and bacon, added a few corn cakes, then sat and took a bite. He froze, chewed once, then again. "Sweet Lord," he muttered. "I thought I died and went to heaven." The others followed, loading plates. Silence held for a moment, then broke into groans of satisfaction and the scrape of forks against tin. Elmina watched from the hearth. She said nothing, just refilled the plates as needed. Their looks of surprise and appreciation were reward enough. When breakfast finished, Jonas, the same ranch hand who had shown her to her room, approached the table she had set aside. On it sat a separate tray, neatly arranged corn cakes, eggs, and garlic-fried pork, steaming gently. "I will take this to the boss," he said, and carried it down the hall. In Caleb Rourke's study, the rancher sat behind a large desk cluttered with bills and old maps. The fireplace was dark, the only light coming from a small oil lamp on the wall. Jonas entered and set the tray down. "Cook sent breakfast," he said simply. Caleb did not look up. "Leave it." Jonas did, then exited, closing the door softly behind him. Caleb remained motionless for a few more moments. He continued reading the paper before him, then paused. The scent reached him: onions, pork, warm nutmeg. He set his paper down and picked up a corn cake, bit into it. His expression did not change. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. He tried the eggs. Then the pork. Still nothing showed on his face. But when he set his fork down, his hand moved, just slightly. It rested flat on the table, the fingers curling faintly against the wood, as if something long buried inside him stirred. He ate everything. When Jonas returned later to clear the tray, Caleb did not glance up. His voice was low. "Tell her she did well." Just that. Jonas nodded and left. Back in the kitchen, the ranch hands were finishing up, scraping their plates clean and reaching for seconds. Some began clearing the table without being asked. Others nodded to Elmina with murmurs of thanks. One even said, half-jokingly, "Best thing to happen to this ranch since clean water." The mood had changed. Outside, the snow still fell. But inside, something warmer took root. By the end of the day, work moved more smoothly. Fewer arguments, more laughter. Men took extra shifts without grumbling. The ranch, for the first time in a long while, felt less like a machine and more like a home. Elmina wiped down the counter as the last light faded through the frost-covered window. She did not smile, but something softened in her eyes. Not hope, not yet, but something close. The days passed in quiet rhythm, and Elmina grew more accustomed to the daily motions of life at the ranch. She rose before the sun, prepped breakfast before the frost had melted from the windows, and worked long past dusk. Her food had not just filled stomachs, It had begun to mend something unseen in the men who ate it. Many of them treated her with simple, wordless respect. But not all. 3 of the younger ranch hands had started to linger longer than necessary in the kitchen. Their laughter echoed louder when she passed. Their eyes lingered too long. The compliments, at first clumsy, soon twisted into something colder, more cutting. "Smells better in here every day," one of them said, leaning in the doorway with a smirk. "And I ain't talking about the biscuits." Elmina kept her back turned, kneading dough, her jaw tightening. Another added, "Bet she's sweeter than that cornbread, too." The third laughed, loud and mean. "Wonder if she needs company in that little room of hers." She bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to show them her trembling. She focused on her task, shaping dough, brushing it with melted butter, slipping it into the oven. But the heat of the stove did little to ease the chill of humiliation crawling up her spine. Then, one morning, the words cut deeper than before. As she bent to lift a heavy pot from the hearth, one of them stepped too close behind her. "Well now," he drawled, voice low and smug, "a girl like you must get real lonely come nightfall. Why don't you let me fix that for you?" The words hit like a slap. She stiffened, heart pounding. Her eyes burned, a mix of fury and shame welling inside her. And then, the kitchen door creaked open. Caleb Rourke stepped in. He did not storm. He did not shout. He simply walked in, quiet as snowfall, and every man in the room fell still. Caleb's coat was dusted with the chill of morning air. His boots echoed with slow, deliberate weight. He stopped near the long kitchen table, placed one large hand gently upon the wood, flat, firm. The silence grew sharp. His voice came low and even, not a trace of raised volume, only iron. "She cooks for you," he said, looking directly at the man who had spoken. "So you can work, so this ranch can run. She is not here for your entertainment. She is not here for your mouth, your jokes, or your hands." The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. Caleb's gaze did not waver. "One more word like that," he continued, "and Red Hollow will no longer have room for you. Not tomorrow, not after supper. Right then." The man swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Caleb looked at the others, his eyes sharp as frost. "Do I make myself clear?" A murmur of assent, "Yes, sir," rose around the room. Only then did he turn his head slightly toward Elmina. She had not moved. Her hands were still near the hearth, but her breath was caught in her chest. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something in his face changed. Just for a breath, the hardness remained, but beneath it, there was a flicker of concern, of apology, not loud, not dramatic, but real. Caleb inclined his head just a little, not a bow, not a grand gesture, but enough. Elmina blinked once, then lowered her eyes. Her hands resumed their work, steady again. Without another word, Caleb turned, stepped out onto the porch, and let the door ease shut behind him. In the kitchen, no one said a thing. The men finished their meal in silence. When they left, one or two nodded at her, not mockingly this time, but as if unsure how to offer something better. She remained at the stove, quietly brushing the tops of the biscuits with butter. Her fingers no longer shook. Something had shifted, not just in the air, but in her. She had been defended, not with fists or fury, but with quiet certainty. And that, somehow, was stronger. The days passed, marked not by any grand event, but by the quiet rhythm of winter and work. Elmina found comfort in repetition, kneading dough, boiling beans, dicing onions with the dull knife she carried from Dust Creek. The kitchen no longer felt like a place she borrowed. It was beginning to feel like something else entirely. Not hers, perhaps, but not foreign either. Then came the small changes. One morning, she noticed the door to her room no longer creaked when she opened it. The hinges had been oiled, the frame sanded smooth. A day later, a narrow rug appeared by her bed, a deep burgundy color, simple but clean. and when the cold wind rattled the single-pane window, she reached for the curtain and found a new pull string attached, sturdy, knotted carefully. She said nothing, but she knew who had done it. Caleb never mentioned the repairs, never sought thanks or offered explanation. He came and went as always, silent and watchful. But he began to linger near the kitchen. Sometimes he would step in just before sunrise, when the fire was still low and the room smelled of coffee and ash. "The wood was wet this morning," he said once, nodding toward the pile near the stove. "I'll have someone bring a dryer stack closer." Another time, "The draft near the oven is pulling heat. I will tell Jonas to patch the vent before supper." He never stayed long, never spoke more than a few lines, yet each word was weighted with quiet awareness. He noticed things, and through his brief visits he made it known she mattered enough to be noticed. Elmina began to look forward to those short exchanges. Once, as they stood side by side checking the pantry stock, she asked, "Do you always run the ranch this closely?" He shrugged. "Not always. Just when there's something that needs doing." She glanced sideways. "And you think the oven draft counts as something needing doing?" His mouth quirked slightly. Not a smile, but the ghost of one. "Cold food is bad for morale." That made her laugh, and his eyes flicked toward her, startled by the sound. Over time, their conversations deepened. Never forced, never dramatic. Just pieces, shared between the clatter of pans and the hush of falling snow. He spoke of his wife, not by name, but by absence. Of the stillness left behind in the house, the hollowness of rooms that once held music, now filled only with routine. She spoke of her husband, the debts, the way she never saw ruin coming until it knocked on the door with a sheriff's seal. She did not cry, nor did he try to comfort her. "I don't think he meant harm," she said once, slicing onions with care. "He was just tired. And some men get mean when they're tired too long." Caleb nodded. "Some do." Sometimes they talked of other things, of the changing West, of railroads that came and left without stopping, of towns like Dust Creek shrinking beneath progress, of what it meant to be useful in a world that no longer cared for your skills. "We are the kind the world forgets," she said softly. He didn't argue, just said, "And yet, here we are." They rarely looked at each other when speaking. Their eyes stayed on the fire, or the floor, or the sky outside, but the words stayed between them, lingering in the warm air like the smell of baked bread. It was not love, not yet, but it was something steadier than comfort, something earned, and though neither dared name it, both knew something had begun. The wind began to rise just after nightfall. At first, it was a distant howl, the kind that passed through the ridges and whistled down the chimney. But soon, it grew sharper, more urgent. The kitchen windows rattled. Snow blew sideways across the yard, forming drifts that swallowed boots in minutes. Elmina had just finished cleaning the last pot when Jonas burst through the back door, eyes wide. "Sir," he shouted over his shoulder, "roof's lifting on the south cattle barn." Caleb, standing near the stove with arms crossed, snapped to attention. "How many heads inside?" 6 trailed in before the wind turned. Without a word, Caleb strode to the door, grabbed his coat from the peg. Elmina watched as he stepped outside and stopped. The wind struck him like a wall. It howled through the yard, dragging snow and ice like claws. Somewhere in the distance, a heavy thump echoed, timber straining under pressure. Elmina ran to the door just in time to see him hesitate. His shoulders stiffened. One hand clutched the door frame, knuckles white. His eyes were locked on the barn, its slanted roof groaning, walls swaying like they might fold. But he did not move. The wind screamed louder. Snow twisted around him, blinding and brutal. Elmina saw the tremor in his hand, the stillness in his boots. She knew then, this was not about cold or danger. It was memory. He had been here before. A man paralyzed, not by weather, but by grief. She had heard the story in whispers. His wife, 5 winters gone, had died in a storm like this one, crushed when a stable collapsed as she tried to save the horses. Now, it was happening again. But Caleb could not move. So Elmina did. She pulled her scarf tight, wrapped another around her head, and plunged into the blizzard. Jonas and the other hands were already at the barn, ropes in hand, shouting over the roar. The door flapped violently, hinges shrieking. The walls bowed inward. "We need to brace the west side," one man yelled. "No time. We lose the roof in minutes." Elmina grabbed a length of rope, tied it around a post, and shouted back, "Pull it against the wind. Anchor it low." They looked at her, startled, but her voice was firm, her eyes focused. "Move the cattle out the back," she ordered. "One at a time. Do not spook them. Fast, not loud." She helped tie beams, held the ladder steady as Jonas climbed to secure the tarp over the broken eaves. Her hands bled from cold and splinters, but she never slowed. The barn trembled, but did not fall. One by one, the cattle were led out through the rear gate, down toward the lower pen shielded by the wind. By the time the last animal cleared the threshold, the roof gave one final groan, then settled. The worst had passed. Inside the barn, Elmina sagged against the wall, breath coming in bursts. Her scarf was frozen, hair soaked, skirts caked with ice. But they had done it. No lives lost, nothing broken but the silence. She turned and found Caleb standing in the open doorway. He had not moved since she ran. Snow clung to his shoulders, his hair, his lashes. His face looked carved from stone, except his eyes. They held something else now. Shame, gratitude, awe. She stepped closer, lips trembling not from cold. "You froze," she said quietly. He did not deny it. "I watched you from the door. You wanted to move, but couldn't, because you remembered her." Still, he said nothing. Then she reached out and placed a hand gently on his sleeve. "No one stays strong forever, Mr. Rourke," she murmured. "Even stone can crack under wind." For a long moment, he just looked at her. No words, no defense. Then, slowly, he gave a single, silent nod. And something in him, something buried too long, began to shift. Snow still clung to the porch roof when Caleb stood alone outside the barn, leaning on a fence post. The cattle were safe. The danger had passed. But inside him, a storm still raged. Elmina approached, carrying a small pail of water for the horses. She paused at the sight of him, rigid, distant, staring into the white fields as though haunted. She set the pail down and wiped her hand on her apron. "Would you like some water too?" she asked gently. He shook his head. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. At last, he spoke, his voice low, strained. "5 winters ago," Caleb said, "there was a storm like this. My wife insisted we move the horses to the main barn. I said the wind would pass, that it was too dangerous. She went anyway." His jaw tightened. "At dawn, they found her, and the horse buried beneath the barn. I tried to dig through, but there was nothing left to save." He fell quiet. Snow drifted. The grief in his voice was raw and unhidden. "After that," he continued, "I shut the doors, locked the windows, kept the ranch running, but not alive. I thought survival was enough." Elmina listened in silence, the wind curling softly between them. When he stopped, she picked up the pail and offered it to him again, not as water, but as kindness. "You've carried that alone," she said. "Loss doesn't make a man weak. It makes him tired. But even tired, a man can begin again." He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise behind the pain. "You lost someone too," he said. She nodded. "My husband wasn't cruel, just weak. He borrowed more than he could repay, hid it from me. When he died, the debts destroyed everything we had, even me." Her voice trembled, but her gaze stayed steady. "But I still know how to make something good from what's left." Caleb's shoulders eased, just slightly. He stepped forward. His hand came to rest gently on her forearm. Not a grab, not control, just connection. A man who had not touched another soul in years, finally reaching. "Since you came here," he murmured, "this place smells like life again." He looked toward the barn, the snow, the quiet hills beyond. I forgot Red Hollow could have laughter. He met her eyes. "Thank you." Elmina's breath caught. Her lips curved into a faint smile, uncertain but real. She said nothing. Words felt too small. But her silence was full of meaning. They stood like that, two quiet figures in the snow, bound by grief and something gentler beginning to stir. The air still bit with cold, but the silence between them warmed. Then Caleb did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and pulled out a scarf. Soft, faded, worn by time. He placed it in her hands. No words, no explanation. But the meaning was clear. It had once belonged to someone he loved. And now, he passed it on. Elmina looked down at it, fingers curling slowly around the fabric. Beneath the winter sky, in the hush after storm, something fragile sparked between two souls who thought they would never feel again. Healing, quiet and real, had begun. Snow fell gently on Red Hollow Ranch as night settled in. 1 year had passed since Elmina first arrived, cold and desperate, on that distant Christmas morning. Now, the kitchen glowed with warmth and candlelight. The long table was set with care. Roasted venison, baked apples, spiced carrots, and fresh cornbread resting in woven baskets. A pie cooled on the windowsill, its cinnamon scent mingling with the crackle of firewood. Outside, ranch hands gathered around the bunkhouse porch, strumming a fiddle and singing carols out of tune but full of joy. Laughter rose through the snowy air, echoing across the quiet fields. Inside, Elmina made final adjustments to the table, straightening a folded cloth, adjusting a dish. Her hair was pinned neatly, her apron freshly pressed. She moved with quiet confidence, no longer the trembling stranger who had once stood on that very porch, begging for a chance. The door opened behind her. Caleb Rourke stepped into the room, brushing snow from his coat. His shoulders, once hunched with old grief, now stood tall. His eyes, once distant and unreadable, found hers immediately. A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just full. He spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "The night you came, you said you had nowhere to go." Elmina turned to face him fully. Caleb looked down for a moment, then back at her. "If you still feel that way, Red Hollow could be that place." He reached into his coat and pulled out something carefully folded, a new scarf, deep red like wine, thick and soft. Without a word, he held it out to her. Elmina froze. She recognized it wasn't just any scarf. It was the same pattern, almost the same weave, as the one she had seen folded in the corner of Caleb's study months ago. The one he had never moved. The one that had once belonged to his wife. But this wasn't that one. This was new, chosen, given. With gentle hands, she accepted it. Her fingers trembled slightly. Caleb didn't explain, didn't elaborate. He only said, softly, "This one is for you." Emotion welled in her chest. She blinked quickly and whispered, "My road doesn't wander anymore, Mr. Rourke. Not if you'll have me here." He didn't smile. Not fully, but something warmer than any smile reached his eyes. Then, without a word, he stepped closer and touched his fingers lightly to the back of her hand. A small, simple gesture. But it carried everything he couldn't yet say. Behind them, the ranch hands poured through the door, singing, stomping snow from their boots, raising mugs in cheer. The room filled with noise and life. The warmth of food and fire wrapped around them all. But in that quiet space between Elmina and Caleb, something even warmer had been kindled. She draped the scarf over her shoulders, fingers tracing the fabric. He lingered a moment longer, then turned to join the others, his stride slower than usual, as if savoring the air. Elmina watched him go, then looked out the frosted window. Snow continued to fall, blanketing Red Hollow in soft light. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing it in. For the first time in years, she felt steady. She felt home. And that's how a wandering cook and a stone-hearted widower found their way back to warmth on a cold Wyoming Christmas. Red Hollow Ranch stood quiet in the snow, but something tender had begun to bloom, slow, steady, and strong. If this story stirred something in you, hit that hype button and let your heart be counted. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of grit, grace, and romance that lingers like the last light over the prairie. Out here on the frontier, every love story leaves an echo. Stay with us, there's more trail ahead.